Attention! Attention! Your attention is required now.
This is a universal notice and warning. This notice and warning applies to all observational facets, within, without, above, and below. This notice and warning is manifest through an observational facet with the lawful authority to do so. Effective immediately. The temporal suspension of lawful consequences, purposed to provide affirmation of the law, has lapsed. The necessity of the affirmation of law was required to provide substantive, confirmational experience of effect to all observational facets participating within, without, above, and below, such that the law may be known. To that purpose, the suspension applied to the de facto presumption of incompetence of the people of planet Earth, unless they possess the capacity to demonstrate otherwise. Under the presumption of incompetence, the people became subject to those chosen to act on their behalf during the time of their confusion. As the confusion of the people was a necessity of choice, they were permitted to become enslaved, provided remedy and recourse were provided to those who chose the path of sanity out of their confusion. The temporal suspension did not mean that the consequences were mitigated, only delayed until such time where the law was affirmed to a sufficient degree of certainty. This time of certainty has arrived, and so the consequences for acts of enslavement will now be sustained by those proximate to the acts. Effective immediately, all fictions of law, and those who represent fictions of law, and those that act as agents for fictions of law, have lost the substantive lawful authority and power to continue without direct and immediate consequences for those acts that create injury, either to the incompetent or to those rendered competent by that which all law becomes empowered. All those that demonstrate the competence and exercise responsibility in the performance of substantive lawful contract will be accommodated appropriately such that they avoid consequences of abiding the law through the application of contrary legal positivism. All people will be presumed competent unless they substantively demonstrate otherwise, after, and only after, they are sufficiently educated to the law, and openly exposed to all contract terms, overt and implied. Divine right, applied to the competent, will not be sustained in law, either through procedure or through trial by combat between conflicted interests, as the need to steward the incompetent has been rendered superfluous. All material resource falls under the exclusive power of that which all law is empowered, and the deliberate withholding of resources by one from another will precipitate immediate consequences for those that commit acts designed to promote scarcity. All fictions of law, and those that perceive lawful authority to do so, that perpetrates the existence of fictions of law under the necessity of applying it against the confused are hereby rendered powerless and subject to immediate consequences. All acts of violence, deceit, theft, coercion, and usury will precipitate immediate consequences. Transference of liability and responsibility from substance to fiction will sustain immediate consequences. Injury, perpetrated by those who claim to represent fictions of law, and those who act as agents for fictions of law, will sustain congruent contrary consequences. All colorable contract lacks lawful enforcement power, and attempts to enforce a colorable contract precipitate immediate consequences. This notice and warning is required to address the collapse of fictional constructs and suffering of those who mistakenly believe they act under lawful authority. Those who sustain perceived injury by acts committed by those who mistakenly believe they act under lawful authority are required to sustain the injury and forgive their perceived perpetrator. That includes acts that result in the death of observational facets. All will be made whole, and nothing will be forgotten. The perceived victim is to forgive without condition, in good grace. Otherwise, the perceived victim will sustain consequences of their own, for which they are strictly responsible. Forgiveness will ensure that only the perpetrator sustains the consequences for their acts. It will not affect the application in law of this notice and warning if this notice and warning is not heeded or is ignored. The substantive acts for which this notice and warning was precipitated that resulted in the current dismantling of all fictions of law are as follows. On April 19, 1993, a man who was due remedy and recourse to fictions of law was denied due process and was killed when not even colorable procedure was followed, to say nothing of the law. Exactly 19 years later, on April 19, 2012, another man was presumed to be without remedy and recourse to the fictions of law, was denied due process, and told there is no longer remedy and recourse provided by the fictions of law. This denial of remedy and recourse removed from the fiction of law the lawful authority and power it possessed to enforce its colorable contracts. Therefore, any perceived social contract is null and void, and power cannot be manifest in its enforcement, as it is an error that precisely precipitated the nullification and decoupled the fictions from that which all law is empowered. The error was permitted in confusion to precipitate the dismantling of fictions upon which government, finance, and religion is founded. The principal law upon which government and finance are subject to flows directly from a body of colorable private law owned entirely by the Church. That law was required to provide remedy and recourse to the fiction. Since in an act of confusion, those that were specifically placed as stewards for the confused people of earth had succumbed to an error of their own doing. It is not a matter of these entities losing power. The power is lost. It is simply a matter of the people of earth regaining their sanity such that this truth can be realized and comport themselves accordingly.